The year was 1893, and Dr. William Dolan had seen more death than any man should witness in a lifetime. As the chief coroner of Fall River, Massachusetts, he had examined bodies pulled from the Taunton River, victims of industrial accidents, and countless souls claimed by disease and desperation. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for what he would discover in a single photograph taken inside the Borden house on that sweltering August morning when Lizzie Borden's parents lay butchered in pools of their own blood. It began like any other case. The call came at 11:47 a.m. on August 4, 1892. Andrew and Abby Borden, found dead under circumstances so brutal that even the hardened police officers who first arrived at the scene had to step outside to compose themselves. Dr. Dolan arrived within the hour, his medical bag in hand, expecting another routine examination. He had no way of knowing that this case would haunt him for the rest of his days. That a single enhanced photograph would reveal a truth so devastating it would literally bring him to his knees. The Borden house at 92 2nd Street stood like a monument to middle-class respectability. 3 stories of Victorian propriety, with its bay windows and modest front porch. It was the kind of home that neighbors admired and children walked past with quiet reverence. But on that August day, it became a charnel house, a place where the American dream turned into the American nightmare. Dr. Dolan entered through the front door, past the curious onlookers who had gathered like vultures, their faces pressed against the windows, hungry for any glimpse of the horror within. The house felt different immediately. The air was thick, not just with the metallic smell of blood, but with something else, something that made his skin crawl and his breath catch in his throat. It was as if the very walls had absorbed the violence, the terror, the final moments of 2 human beings who had trusted the wrong person. Andrew Borden lay on the sitting room sofa, his face so savagely destroyed that identification was only possible through his clothing and the distinctive ring he wore on his left hand. 11 crushing blows had been delivered with such force that fragments of skull and brain matter had embedded themselves in the horsehair stuffing of the sofa. The killer had continued striking long after death, driven by a rage so pure and concentrated that it transcended mere murder and entered the realm of obliteration. But it was upstairs, in the guest bedroom, where Dr. Dolan found something that would change everything he thought he knew about death, about evil, and about the capacity for human beings to hide the most monstrous truths behind masks of innocence. Abby Borden lay face down on the floor beside the bed, her gray dress soaked in blood that had long since congealed into a dark, sticky mass. 19 blows to the back of her head and neck had been delivered with the same methodical precision as those that killed her husband. But this was not a crime of passion. This was execution. This was hatred distilled into its purest form and wielded with surgical precision. Dr. Dolan had seen enough murder scenes to recognize the signs, the angles of the wounds, the depth of penetration, the way the blood had spattered across the floral wallpaper in perfect arcs that told the story of each strike. Someone had stood over Abby Borden and systematically destroyed her, taking their time, making sure that each blow found its mark, that each impact brought them closer to their goal of complete and total annihilation. As he worked, photographing the scene, measuring the wounds, documenting every detail for the inevitable trial, Dr. Dolan couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial. The evidence pointed to Lizzie Borden, the 32-year-old spinster daughter, who had discovered her father's body and whose alibis crumbled under even the slightest scrutiny. But something nagged at him, something that whispered in the quiet moments between his examinations that the truth was far more complex and far more terrifying than a simple case of patricide. The investigation consumed the town. Lizzie Borden, with her pale complexion and carefully composed demeanor, became the focal point of a media circus that would make her name synonymous with murder for generations to come. She maintained her innocence with the kind of steel-spined determination that either spoke to genuine righteousness or to a level of cunning that bordered on the supernatural. Dr. Dolan testified at the trial. He presented his findings with the clinical detachment that his profession demanded. The wounds, the angles, the timing. Everything pointed to someone who had intimate knowledge of the house, someone who knew the routines of the victims, someone who had access and opportunity, and, most importantly, someone who could walk away from the scene covered in blood and somehow emerge clean and composed. Mere minutes later, but the jury acquitted her. The evidence, while damning, was circumstantial. The murder weapon was never found. Lizzie's dress, which should have been soaked in blood, had mysteriously been burned before it could be examined. And perhaps most importantly, The Victorian sensibilities of the time simply could not accept that a well-bred Christian woman could be capable of such savage brutality. Dr. Dolan retired from his position as coroner 3 years after the murders. The case had taken its toll, not just professionally but personally. He had seen the face of evil, and it wore the mask of respectability. He moved to a small cottage on the outskirts of town, where he spent his days tending to a modest garden and trying to forget the horrors he had witnessed in the Borden house. But the past has a way of refusing to stay buried. In 1923, 30 years after the murders, Dr. Dolan received an unexpected visitor. Thomas Edison's assistant, a young man named Marcus Webb, had been experimenting with new photographic enhancement techniques developed for Edison's motion picture work. He had heard about the Borden case and wondered if Dr. Dolan might have any photographs that could benefit from modern enhancement technology. Dr. Dolan had kept copies of all the crime scene photographs in a locked trunk in his basement. He had told himself it was for historical purposes, that someday they might be needed for academic study or legal review. But the truth was simpler and more disturbing. He couldn't let go. Some part of him knew that the real story had never been told, that justice had not been served, and that somewhere in those grainy, poorly lit photographs lay the key to a truth that had eluded everyone involved in the original investigation. Webb selected several photographs for enhancement, using a new process that involved multiple exposures and chemical treatments that could bring out details invisible to the naked eye. Most of the enhanced images revealed nothing new. Clearer views of the wounds, better definition of the blood spatter patterns, more precise measurements of the crime scenes. But one photograph, taken in the guest bedroom, where Abby Borden had died, revealed something that made both men question everything they thought they knew about reality itself. The original photograph had been taken from the doorway, showing Abby's body and the surrounding area. It was a standard crime scene shot, properly composed, and technically adequate for its purpose. But when Webb applied his enhancement process, when he brought out the shadows and revealed the hidden details, they saw something that should have been impossible. Standing in the corner of the room, partially obscured by shadows but clearly visible once enhanced, was a figure, not Lizzie Borden, not anyone who had been in the house that day, but someone else entirely. Someone who appeared to be watching the scene unfold with the detached interest of a casual observer. Dr. Dolan's hands shook as he held the enhanced photograph up to the light. The figure was tall, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The face was partially obscured, but what could be seen was wrong in ways that defied description. The proportions were subtly off, as if someone had tried to construct a human face from memory and had gotten the details almost but not quite right. Webb suggested that it might be a double exposure, a common problem with the primitive cameras of the 1890s, but Dr. Dolan knew better. He had taken that photograph himself. He had been alone in the room with Abby Borden's body. There had been no one else present, no one standing in that corner. No one watching with those eyes that seemed to hold depths of knowledge that no human should possess. As they studied the photograph more closely, more details emerged. The figures, hands, visible at its sides, were wrong. Too long, with fingers that seemed to extend far beyond normal human proportions. And there was something around its feet, something that looked like shadows but moved independently, as if they were living things responding to the presence of their master. Dr. Dolan felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. This was not a photographic anomaly. This was not a trick of light and shadow. This was something that had been there, in that room, on that day, watching as Abby Borden died. Watching, and perhaps doing far more than merely observing. The implications were staggering. If this figure had been present during the murders, then everything about the case needed to be reconsidered. Lizzie Borden might have been innocent after all, not of knowledge of the crimes, but of actually committing them. She might have been as much a victim as her parents, caught in a web of supernatural horror that no one could have imagined. But there was more. As Dr. Dolan examined the enhanced photograph with a magnifying glass, he noticed something else that made his blood run cold. Reflected in the window behind the figure, barely visible but unmistakably present, was another face, a face he recognized, a face that belonged to someone who should have been downstairs, someone who had claimed to be in the barn at the time of the murders. It was Lizzie herself, but not the Lizzie who had been questioned by police, not the composed and carefully controlled woman who had faced trial and emerged victorious. This was something else wearing Lizzie's face, something that looked at the camera with eyes that held knowledge of things that existed beyond the boundaries of human understanding. The revelation hit Dr. Dolan like a physical blow. He had been wrong about everything. The murders had not been committed by Lizzie Borden in any conventional sense. They had been committed by something else. Something that had taken her form, used her body, controlled her actions, while the real Lizzie watched helplessly from somewhere deep inside her own mind. Webb, seeing Dr. Dolan's reaction, tried to offer rational explanations: light refraction, chemical artifacts from the enhancement process, pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces and patterns where none exist. But Dr. Dolan knew what he was seeing. He had spent his entire career studying death, documenting its effects, understanding its mechanisms. He knew the difference between natural and unnatural, between human and something else entirely. That night, alone in his cottage, Dr. Dolan began to research. He delved into local histories, old newspapers, church records, anything that might provide context for what he had seen in that photograph. What he discovered filled him with a terror so profound that sleep became impossible and food lost all taste. Fall River had a history that extended far beyond its establishment as an industrial town. The land on which the Borden house stood had been the site of strange occurrences for over 2 centuries. Native American tribes had avoided the area, claiming it was cursed, inhabited by entities that fed on human suffering and despair. Early colonial records spoke of unexplained disappearances, of entire families found dead under mysterious circumstances, of children who vanished in the night and were found days later speaking in languages that no scholar could identify. The pattern was consistent across the centuries. Every few decades, something would awaken in that place. Families would be destroyed, lives would be shattered, and then the horror would retreat, dormant but never truly gone, waiting for the right moment to emerge again. Dr. Dolan realized that the Borden murders had not been an isolated incident. They had been part of a cycle, a feeding pattern that stretched back generations. And if the pattern held true, it would happen again. The entity, whatever it was, would find another host, another family, another opportunity to satisfy its appetite for human anguish. As he researched deeper, Dr. Dolan found references to similar entities in cultures around the world. The ancient Mesopotamians had written about demons that could inhabit human bodies, forcing them to commit acts of unspeakable violence. Medieval European texts described creatures that fed on the psychic energy released during moments of extreme terror and pain. Native American traditions spoke of wendigos and skinwalkers, beings that could take human form while retaining their monstrous nature. But what Dr. Dolan had captured in that photograph was different from all of these. It was older, more sophisticated, more patient. It didn't simply possess its victims. It studied them, learned from them, became them in ways that went beyond mere mimicry. It was evolution in reverse, a creature that had learned to hide among humans by becoming the perfect predator. The enhanced photograph revealed other details that had been invisible in the original. Strange symbols carved into the wooden floor beneath Abby Borden's body. Symbols that matched no known alphabet or religious tradition. Shadows that fell in directions that defied the available light sources. And most disturbing of all, what appeared to be other figures, barely visible even with enhancement. Standing in doorways and corners throughout the house, Dr. Dolan realized that the Borden house had not been the scene of a simple double murder. It had been the site of a supernatural gathering, a convocation of entities that had come to witness and perhaps participate in the feeding. The brutal murders had been just the beginning, the appetizer for a feast that extended far beyond the physical realm. As the days passed, Dr. Dolan's obsession with the photograph grew. He found himself staring at it for hours, trying to decipher its secrets, to understand the true nature of what had occurred in that house 30 years earlier. The rational part of his mind insisted that he was seeing things that weren't there. That grief and guilt over his role in the investigation had driven him to construct elaborate fantasies to explain what had always been a straightforward case of domestic violence. But the evidence was undeniable. The photograph showed things that could not be explained by conventional means. And as Dr. Dolan continued his research, he began to find corroborating evidence in the most unlikely places. A daguerreotype from the 1840s, taken in the same area where the Borden house would later be built, showed similar shadowy figures in the background. A newspaper account from 1867 described a family found dead in their home, under circumstances remarkably similar to the Borden murders, complete with reports of strange shadows and unexplained sounds. A diary entry from a Fall River minister, dated 1878, described disturbing dreams about dark watchers who stood in the corners of his church during services. The pattern was undeniable. Something had been active in Fall River for decades, possibly centuries. leaving a trail of death and mystery in its wake. The Borden murders had not been an aberration. They had been part of a long-standing tradition of supernatural violence that the town had unconsciously learned to accept and forget. Dr. Dolan also discovered references to Lizzie Borden's behavior in the months leading up to the murders. Neighbors had reported seeing her standing motionless in her yard at odd hours, staring at nothing with an expression they described as empty. She had complained of strange dreams, of voices that spoke to her in languages she didn't understand, of feeling as though she were watching her own life from a great distance. These were not the symptoms of someone planning a murder. They were the symptoms of someone being prepared for possession, being slowly hollowed out and ready to serve as a vessel for something that existed beyond human understanding. The more Dr. Dolan learned, the more he understood that Lizzie Borden had been as much a victim as her parents. She had been chosen, selected for reasons that had nothing to do with her personality or her family situation, and everything to do with her susceptibility to supernatural influence. The entity had found in her the perfect host, intelligent enough to navigate human society, isolated enough to avoid close scrutiny, and emotionally fragile enough to be manipulated without significant resistance. But this knowledge brought Dr. Dolan no comfort. If anything, it made the situation more terrifying. If Lizzie had been innocent of conscious wrongdoing, if she had been controlled by forces beyond her understanding, then the real murderer was still out there, still active, still hunting for its next host. Dr. Dolan began to experience strange phenomena in his own home. Objects would move overnight, appearing in different locations without any explanation. He would wake to find windows and doors open that he was certain he had closed before going to bed. Most disturbing of all, he began to see shadows moving in his peripheral vision, shapes that vanished the moment he turned to look at them directly. He realized that his investigation had attracted attention. The entity, or entities, that had been responsible for the Borden murders were aware of his research. They knew that he had seen too much, understood too much, posed a greater threat to their continued existence. The enhanced photograph became both his greatest discovery and his greatest curse. He couldn't stop looking at it, couldn't stop trying to extract more information from its shadowy depths. But each time he studied it, he felt something looking back at him, studying him with the same intensity that he brought to his examination of it. Webb, the Edison assistant who had enhanced the photograph, began to experience similar phenomena. He reported strange dreams in which he found himself standing in the Borden house, watching the murders unfold from the perspective of the shadowy figure in the corner. He described feeling a terrible hunger during these dreams, a need to witness and participate in the destruction of human life that left him nauseated and terrified upon waking. Dr. Dolan knew that they had opened a door that should have remained closed. By enhancing the photograph, by revealing the hidden truth of what had occurred in the Borden house, they had created a connection between themselves and the entities responsible for the murders. They had become part of the pattern, potential victims in the next cycle of supernatural violence. The final revelation came when Dr. Dolan discovered a letter hidden in Lizzie Borden's belongings. A letter that had somehow escaped the attention of investigators 30 years earlier, written in her hand but expressing thoughts and knowledge that no human should possess. It described the true nature of the entities that had controlled her actions. They were old. Older than human civilization, older than recorded history. They had existed in the spaces between reality and nightmare, since before the first human had learned to use fire. They fed on the psychic energy released during moments of extreme terror and pain. But they were selective in their feeding, preferring victims who were connected by blood and family bonds. The stronger the emotional connections between the victims, the more nourishing their deaths became. The letter described the selection process in clinical detail. The entities would scout for suitable hosts, usually individuals who were isolated, frustrated, or emotionally vulnerable. They would begin the process of possession slowly, infiltrating the host's dreams, influencing their thoughts, gradually eroding their will and sense of self until they became perfect vessels for supernatural violence. Lizzie had been chosen because of her unique family situation. Unmarried at 32, financially dependent on her father, emotionally distant from her stepmother, she represented the perfect combination of access, motivation, and vulnerability. The entities had spent months preparing her, filling her dreams with images of violence, whispering suggestions that grew stronger with each passing day, until the line between her thoughts and theirs had completely disappeared. The murders themselves had been ritualistic in nature. The specific number of blows, the positioning of the bodies, The timing of the attacks, all of these elements, had been carefully orchestrated to maximize the psychic energy released during the victim's final moments. The brutality had not been the result of rage or passion. It had been a carefully planned harvest, designed to feed entities that existed on human suffering. But the letter contained one final, devastating revelation. The possession had not ended with the murders. Lizzie Borden had remained under the influence of the entities for the rest of her life, serving as their agent in the human world, helping them identify and prepare future victims. Her acquittal at trial had not been a triumph of justice. It had been exactly what the entities had intended, allowing their primary asset to remain free and operational. Dr. Dolan realized that Lizzie Borden's entire post-trial life had been a carefully constructed facade. Her charitable works, her quiet respectability, her withdrawal from public life, all of it had been designed to provide cover for her true activities. She had been scouting for the entities, identifying potential hosts, preparing the ground for future cycles of supernatural violence. The enhanced photograph had captured just one moment in an ongoing campaign of horror that stretched across decades. The shadowy figures visible in the image were not observers of the murders. They were coordinators, overseeing the successful completion of one phase of a much larger operation. As Dr. Dolan reached this conclusion, the phenomena in his home intensified. Objects began to move while he was watching. The shadows in his peripheral vision became more substantial, more clearly defined. He began to hear voices speaking in languages that predated human speech, discussing his fate in terms that suggested his usefulness as a potential host. He realized that his investigation had been allowed to proceed, not because the entities were unaware of it, but because they wanted him to understand the truth. They wanted him to comprehend the scope and sophistication of their operation, to appreciate the futility of resistance, to accept his role in their next cycle of feeding. The enhanced photograph had been their gift to him, their way of revealing the true nature of reality, while simultaneously ensuring his cooperation. By showing him the supernatural truth behind the Borden murders, they had made him complicit in their activities. He became a keeper of their secrets, a guardian of knowledge that could never be shared without appearing insane. Dr. Dolan understood that he faced an impossible choice. He could try to warn others about the true nature of the entities, but doing so would only result in his institutionalization, or worse. The evidence he had gathered would be dismissed as the ravings of an old man driven mad by guilt and obsession. Or he could remain silent, allowing the entities to continue their activities unopposed, while he lived with the knowledge of horrors that no human mind was equipped to process. But there was a third option, one that the entities had been preparing him for since the day he first looked at the enhanced photograph. He could join them willingly, allow himself to be possessed and used as they had used Lizzie Borden. In exchange, they offered him knowledge of truths that existed beyond human understanding, access to realms of existence that no mortal had ever explored, and freedom from the painful limitations of human consciousness. The choice, they whispered in his dreams, was his to make, but they made it clear that his current situation was unsustainable. He knew too much to be allowed to live as a free agent, but he was too valuable to simply eliminate. His medical knowledge, his understanding of human psychology, his established position in the community, all of these made him an ideal candidate for their purposes. Dr. Dolan spent his final days writing everything down, creating a record of his discoveries and his growing understanding of the supernatural forces that had shaped the Borden case. But as he wrote, he could feel his will being eroded, his sense of self becoming increasingly fragmented. The entities were already beginning the process of possession, preparing him for his new role in their ancient campaign. The last entry in his journal, written in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic as the possession took hold, described his final realization about the true nature of the enhanced photograph. It had not revealed hidden details from the past. It had shown him glimpses of the future. The shadowy figures in the image were not documenting the Borden murders. They were planning the next cycle of violence, using the enhanced photograph as a kind of supernatural blueprint for future operations. And in the reflection in the window, the face that looked so much like Lizzie Borden was not the face of the woman who had been tried and acquitted 30 years earlier. It was the face that Dr. Dolan would wear in the days to come, the mask he would present to the world while serving as the entity's next primary agent. The enhanced photograph had been both revelation and recruitment tool, showing him the truth while simultaneously ensuring his participation in perpetuating it. He had been chosen not, despite his role as coroner in the original case, But because of it, his medical knowledge, his understanding of death and violence, his established credibility in the community, all of these made him the perfect successor to Lizzie Borden's role as the entity's human representative. On the morning of September 15, 1923, Dr. William Dolan was found unconscious on the floor of his study, the enhanced photograph clutched in his hands. When he regained consciousness several hours later, he appeared to have suffered some kind of breakdown. He spoke in fragmented sentences about shadows and watches, about cycles and feeding, about truths too terrible for human minds to process. The attending physician, Dr. Margaret Sullivan, noted that while Dr. Dolan appeared physically unharmed, his personality seemed fundamentally altered. Gone was the careful, methodical approach that had characterized his work as coroner. In its place was a strange combination of detachment and intensity, as if he were observing the world from a great distance, while simultaneously being consumed by knowledge that he could never fully express. Dr. Dolan recovered sufficiently to resume what appeared to be a normal life, but those who knew him well noticed subtle changes. He began to show an unusual interest in local genealogies, spending hours researching family histories and bloodlines. He started attending social gatherings that he had previously avoided, engaging in conversations with a focus and intensity that made his companions uncomfortable. Most disturbing of all, he began to develop relationships with individuals who matched a very specific profile: isolated, emotionally vulnerable, financially dependent on family members who they resented. He offered these people counseling and support, becoming a trusted confidant who helped them explore their deepest frustrations and darkest impulses. The enhanced photograph remained in his possession, displayed prominently in his study, where visitors could not help but notice it. When asked about it, Dr. Dolan would explain that it was a reminder of the complexity of truth, of how much could be hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right technology or the right perspective to reveal its secrets. But those who looked closely at the photograph often reported strange experiences afterward: disturbing dreams, sensations of being watched, glimpses of shadowy figures in their peripheral vision. Several of Dr. Dolan's visitors reported that the photograph seemed to change depending on the angle from which it was viewed, revealing different details or emphasizing different aspects of the scene it captured. Dr. Dolan died in 1931, 8 years after his encounter with the enhanced photograph. His death was attributed to natural causes, but those who found his body noted that he appeared to have been in the middle of writing something when he passed away. The incomplete document, which was later destroyed by authorities, appeared to be a detailed plan for selecting and preparing individuals for some unspecified purpose. The enhanced photograph disappeared after Dr. Dolan's death, along with all of his research materials related to the Borden case. The cottage where he had lived was sold to a young family from Boston, who reported no unusual phenomena during their decade-long residence there. But the cycle continued. Every few years, somewhere in Fall River or the surrounding communities, families would be found dead under circumstances that echoed the Borden murders. The cases were always closed quickly, usually attributed to domestic violence or mental illness. The perpetrators, when they survived, invariably claimed to have no memory of their actions, describing sensations of watching their own lives from outside their bodies. The truth that Dr. Dolan had discovered in that enhanced photograph remained hidden, protected by its own impossibility. Who would believe that a century-old murder case had been orchestrated by supernatural entities that continued to operate in the present day? Who would accept that respected members of the community might be serving as agents for forces that existed beyond human understanding? The enhanced photograph had revealed more than just hidden details from a historical crime scene. It had shown the ongoing nature of a horror that most people preferred to explain away as coincidence or madness. The entities that had controlled Lizzie Borden continued their work, patient and methodical, feeding on human suffering while maintaining the perfect camouflage of respectability and rational explanation. And somewhere, in a basement or an attic or a locked filing cabinet, the enhanced photograph waited to be discovered again, ready to reveal its secrets to the next investigator, who possessed both the technology to see what it truly contained and the courage to accept the implications of that vision. Because the truth, as Dr. Dolan had learned too late, was not something that could be safely contained or quietly forgotten. It was a living thing, growing stronger with each person who encountered it, spreading through communities like a virus that infected minds rather than bodies. The enhanced photograph was not just evidence of past crimes. It was a recruitment tool for future ones, ensuring that the cycle would continue indefinitely. The coroner had fainted, not from shock or disbelief, but from recognition. In that moment, when the enhanced details became clear, when the shadowy figures emerged from the darkness and the true scope of the supernatural conspiracy was revealed, Dr. William Dolan had seen his own future. He had seen the face he would wear, and the role he would play in the next phase of an ancient horror that had learned to hide in plain sight. The truth had not destroyed him in the conventional sense. It had transformed him, absorbed him, made him part of something larger and more terrible than any individual crime or criminal. And in doing so, it had ensured its own survival, its own continued growth, its own perpetual feast on the fear and suffering of those who remained blissfully unaware of the real nature of the world they inhabited. The enhanced photograph remains lost, but not forgotten. Somewhere, in some collection or archive, it waits for the next person who possesses both the means to reveal its secrets and the misfortune to understand what those secrets truly mean. When that day comes, when technology once again makes visible what was meant to remain hidden, the cycle will continue. The truth will claim another guardian, and the entities that have fed on human suffering for centuries will add another agent to their eternal campaign of supernatural horror.